Now we're going to begin Chapter 4, Economic Efficiency, Government Price Setting, and Taxes. This chapter will be broken up into 4 sections and into 3 presentations that you'll see on Blackboard. The first section is Consumer Surplus and Producer Surplus. So we'll explore the ways that both producers and consumers make themselves better off through market transactions. The next section will look at the efficiency of competitive markets, using the ideas of consumer and producer surplus to show how markets result in efficient outcomes. Next, we'll look at government interventions in the market, specifically price floors and price ceilings, where governments set certain prices or limits on prices where they can move, and see what that does to economic efficiency. And finally, we'll look at the economic effect of taxes on transactions. So we'll begin with consumer surplus and producer surplus. So surplus means something that remains above what is used or what is needed. So economists use this idea of surplus to refer to a benefit that people derive from engaging in market transactions. When people engage in market transactions, they place a higher value on the good they're receiving than on the good they're giving up. And the other party does the same thing. So because of this, through trade, both sides of the transaction are able to make themselves better off because they get the good that they value more. So consumer surplus is a difference between the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the actual price they pay. Likewise, producer surplus is a difference between the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept for a good or service and the price it actually receives in the market transaction. First, we'll use an example to explore consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is determined by the demand curve, so we'll build a simple demand curve for a very small market. In this case, we have 4 people that are interested in buying a cup of Kai tea. We can characterize them by the highest price that they're willing to pay. So in this example, Teresa is willing to pay $6 for a cup of tea. Tom is willing to spend $5 for a cup of tea. Terry $4, and Tim $3. So we can take this very simple demand schedule and draw a demand curve. Because there's only 4 people in this market, the demand curve ends up looking like a set of stairs instead of the typical demand curve that we've seen before. But what this does is show where each individual, each consumer in this market, or potential consumer, is willing and able to purchase a cup of tea. So at a price above $6, no cups of tea will be sold. Again, because Teresa values it for $6. So anything more than that isn't worth it for her, and it's not worth it for anyone else. At $6, she will be willing to buy it. At $5, 2 of them will be willing to buy, Teresa and Tom, and so on. So how much benefit do these potential tea consumers actually derive from this market? We can figure this out by using the marginal benefit. So we'll look at the price and compare that to the marginal benefit. The marginal benefit being the additional benefit to a consumer from consuming 1 more unit of a good or service. Remember, the word marginal, what we use in economics, means the next unit. So if the price is low relative to the consumer's willingness to pay, many of the consumers are going to benefit. And if the price is high, few, if any, of the consumers are going to derive this benefit from these market transactions. So let's suppose in this market that the price of tea is $3.50 per cup. Now, if this is the case, then any consumer in this market that values that cup of tea for more than $3.50 is going to be buying a cup of tea. So in this case, Teresa, Tom, and Terry will all buy a cup. Now let's look at Teresa specifically. Teresa was willing to pay $6 for a cup of tea. So that cup of tea is worth $6 to her. But she only had to pay $3.50 for this cup of tea. So she ends up with a net benefit of the price that price she was willing to pay minus the price that she actually paid. So her net benefit is the $6 that she was willing to pay minus the $3.50 that she was forced to pay. So she ends up with a net benefit of $2.50. Looking at the demand curve on the figure on the right, area A represents this net benefit. So this is Teresa's consumer surplus in the tea market. But it's not just Teresa that gets this consumer surplus. Tom and Terry are also able to get this consumer surplus. For Tom, it's going to be equal to $1.50. Tom's willing to pay $5 for a cup of tea. He values a cup of tea at $5. But again, he only has to pay $3.50. So the difference between his value for the good and what he has to pay for it is $1.50. And that can be represented by the area of the rectangle B, on the figure on the right. Likewise, Terry also gains a consumer surplus of 50 cents, the difference between the $4 that she values the cup of tea at and the $3.50 that she has to pay for. So in this market, with four consumers, the sum of the area, the rectangles A, B, and C, is a consumer surplus in the entire tea market. So to generalize, we can say that the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers pay is the consumer surplus. And that graphically represents the difference between the value that consumers place on the good, their highest price they're willing to pay, and the price they actually pay. Now let's see what happens if there's a price change. Let's suppose that the price falls from $3.50 down to $3. So now what's going to happen? Teresa, Tom, and Terry are all going to gain consumer surplus of 50 additional cents. That's the 50 cents that the price dropped. So now at this point, Tim values a cup of tea at $3, and he's being charged $3 for a cup of tea. So Tim is going to be indifferent between buying this cup of tea or not. His well-being is going to be the same no matter what he chooses to do, because he values the good at exactly the market price. So he has no consumer surplus. If he chooses to purchase the tea, he'll be purchasing it for exactly what he values. So he'll be trading something for something else that he believes are of the same worth. So there's no consumer surplus going on there. In this case, the overall consumer surplus remains the area below the demand curve and above the new price. So just like we saw in the previous example. Now, obviously, the market for Kai tea is more than just for consumers. There's a lot more people willing to buy tea. So when there's many consumers, the market demand curve looks like a normal straight line, like we've dealt with before. So in this case, the overall market for tea, in this example, we have a price of $2. So it costs $2 to buy a cup of tea. That's what you're being charged. At this price, 15,000 people are willing to buy a cup of tea per day. So the total consumer surplus in this market is the difference between the demand curve, so the maximum price that consumers are willing to pay, and the price that they actually pay. So now let's look at a real-world example. Having access to broadband internet connection is very beneficial for consumers. It gives us a lot more options for entertainment. It helps us pay our bills, helps us do work from home, helps us do education from home. But just how beneficial is it? We can actually measure how much benefit the consumers derive from access to internet by estimating the consumer surplus derived in the market. So we can see just how valuable this is for people. So in order to do this, we need to know the demand curve for broadband internet service and the price of broadband internet service. Now the price of internet service is very easy to find. That's widely posted from different places that you purchase internet access from. But the demand curve is very difficult, so economists would need to estimate that. So back in 2006, the average price for broadband internet service was about $36 per month. So two economists got together to research this idea, and they estimated the demand curve for broadband internet service, and that's shown in the figure on the right. So the maximum that any consumer is willing to pay was $73.89. The average price they were paying was $36 per month. And at that price, there were 47 million subscribers that were willing to purchase broadband internet service. So in order to find the consumer surplus, they just took the area of that triangle between the demand curve and the price they actually paid. And when they calculated it out, they figured that the consumer surplus, so the value that consumers got above what they had to pay, was $890.4 million per month. So every month, consumers derive this additional benefit from purchasing access to the internet above what they actually had to pay for it. Now that we've talked about how consumers make themselves better off through trade because they value the goods that they're purchasing more than they're forced to pay for it, by the same token, producers can have this sort of surplus. And we can think about it in much the same way as we think of consumer surplus, but this is focusing on the other side of the market. Now, producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price a firm would accept for a good or service and the price that it actually receives. Now, the lowest price a firm is going to be willing to accept for a good or service is going to be the marginal cost of producing that good or service. Remember, marginal cost is the additional cost to a firm for producing one more unit of that good or service. Obviously, because firms face a hard budget constraint, they can't lose money in the long run. They're not going to be willing to sell goods or services for less than it costs them to produce it over the long run. So let's return to this market for tea. Heavenly Tea is a small producer of tea. Now, for the marginal cost of their first unit to produce that first cup of tea is going to be $1.25. That's how much it costs them to produce that one cup. To produce the next cup, it's going to cost them $1.50. So their costs are going to increase. Remember, because supply curves slope upwards, we're going to have marginal costs increasing as firms produce more. For the third cup, it's going to cost them $1.75 to produce. And then the fourth cup is going to cost them $2.25 to produce. So now let's say that the market price for tea is $2. In this case, on the first cup, the consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the price they receive, $2, and the lowest price they're willing to accept, or the marginal cost, which is $1.25. So their consumer surplus is going to be 75 cents, the $2 minus $1.25. And that can be represented on the graph by rectangle A. Now for the second unit, again, they receive $2 for it. That's the price they receive. But the marginal cost is only $1.50, so that's the lowest price they're willing to accept. So the producer surplus is a difference between $2 and $1.50, so it'll be 50 cents. And that can be represented by rectangle B. And finally, for the third cup of tea, the producer surplus can be represented by C, the difference between $2 and $1.75, or 25 cents. When we add up the rectangles of A, B, and C, we get the producer surplus. So the producer surplus is the difference between the price that firms receive for the goods or services that they sell and the marginal cost curve, or the lowest price that they're willing to accept for a good or service. Again, in a normal market where we're selling more than just 4 cups of tea, we're going to see a straight supply curve like we do in most of the markets that we've looked at so far. So if we want to calculate the entire producer surplus received in the market for cups of tea sold, we just take the area between the price and the supply curve. So in this case, the price is $2, and there's 15,000 cups of tea per day sold at that price. So the difference between $2 and that supply curve is going to be the producer surplus. So what exactly do consumer surplus and producer surplus measure? It's important to note that consumer surplus measures the net benefit to consumers from participating in a market. This is not the total benefit. This is because the consumer surplus in a market is equal to the total benefit received by consumers, and this is going to be measured in dollars to keep this easy and the units the same, minus the total amount they pay to obtain the good or service. So it's the total benefit minus the cost that they're paying, which is why we refer to this as the net benefit, because we're taking into account the cost that they're being forced to pay. Similarly, producer surplus measures the net benefit received by producers from participating in a market. So it ends up being the total revenue, that's the total benefit that firms get, minus the cost of production. So producer surplus in a market is equal to the total amount that firms receive from consumers minus the cost of producing that good or service. So just remember, these are net benefits, not total benefits that we're looking at with consumer and producer surplus.